Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, business, and recreation. This week, author Richard Rosenfeld discusses his book, American Aurora, the story of 18th century Philadelphia's leading anti-federalist newspaper.
Richard Rosenfeld, author of American Aurora. It says on page 843 of your book that the most profligate and malicious and false public newspaper that ever existed in any country and under any government is now printed in the city of Philadelphia. And you quote Mucius Scaevola as saying that. Who is Mucius Scaevola, and what is he talking about?
We don't know who Mucius Scaevola is. That was a series of 3 articles that appeared in the Gazette of the United States, which of course was the Gazette, the newspaper that represented most closely the Adams administration, the administration of John Adams. And it was a series of articles that was running about the Philadelphia Aurora. It was speaking of the Philadelphia Aurora, which the Federalists regarded, John Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, as the most profligate newspaper in the United States because it represented the most virulent opposition to the administration of Washington and Adams during the 1790s.
Well, what kind of approach did the Aurora take that got everybody so upset?
Well, the Aurora took the point of view that the Federalists and the Constitution of the United States represented an aristocratic minority in the country who were interested in feathering their own economic nests at the expense of the Democratic majority and were to be feared in their use of the federal government. And in discrediting the Federalists, the Aurora gradually, starting in 1793, began to retell the American Revolution, the history of the country, from a point of view which was that of Democrats, of people who wanted the United States to be a pure democracy and lost, people who fought in the Revolution to create a constitution and a society in which there'd be equal political rights for people, regardless of wealth or property, but found themselves in the 1790s with an administration which seemed to, and with a constitution which seemed to be favoring the wealthy.
This was John Adams' administration?
John Adams and George Washington's administration.
Was the Aurora as vehemently anti-George Washington as it was John Adams?
It became that in the early 1790s, really starting with 1793, but certainly by the mid-1790s, it was as virulent against Washington as it was against Adams. Its most ferocious editorials and its most ferocious pamphlets were published around 1796, which was Washington was still in office.
Now, there are 2 main characters associated with the Aurora, Benjamin Franklin Beach, spelled B-A-C-H-E.
Phonetically,
Beach, and William Duane. Can you tell me about each one of them?
Well, Benjamin Franklin Beach was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, the son of his daughter, Sarah Beach, and her husband, Richard Beach, and someone who grew up with Benjamin Franklin, who accompanied Benjamin Franklin to France when Benjamin Franklin was sent over during the American Revolution to get French help, and lived with Franklin from age 7 until he returned to Pennsylvania at age 16 to enter college. So really was in Franklin's care for a period of 9 years, the critical years of his growing up. And he started the newspaper, the Philadelphia Aurora, within 6 months after Franklin's death in October of 1790, and Franklin had died in April of 1790. William Duane was Beach's successor at the Aurora. Beach died during the yellow fever epidemic of 1798. He died in September, about a month before his sedition trial was to be held. He had been arrested by the Adams administration. He had been indicted and arrested for sedition in June. The federal court was going to reconvene on October 11th, but the yellow fever came in the summer, principally in August, starting in August, and he died in mid-September. And Duane took over when the when the newspaper began to resume its publication at the beginning of November of 1798. Duane, I might add, was an Irish Catholic who had come over to the United States in 1796. He had actually grown up in the northern part of New York. Actually, it was New York then, it's now Vermont. His father had come over from Ireland in 1760, and he had lived there until Duane had lived there as a child till 1765, and Duane's father had was caught up in the French-Indian War and was killed by Indians, and Duane returned to Ireland then.
Now, can you explain a little bit about the writing style of this book, how you wrote it, because it's not written like most history books?
Well, of course, the writing style of the book derives from the fact that when I first sat down to write a story about the Aurora, I found the story so compelling, I was anxious to dramatize it, and I started writing by historical fiction. I had not written a book before, and so this was my first effort, and I had a choice of forms. And what I decided was that the various forms that I had a choice of, I wasn't very satisfied with. And I began to think that since this was a newspaper story about what a newspaper said and the things that were done to silence this newspaper, that perhaps in the day-to-day reporting of the newspaper could tell its own story. And what I try to do in this book is to allow, in effect, the Aurora to tell its own story through day-to-day excerpts of the newspaper itself, usually with answers of the opposing, the administration gazettes in the afternoon. The Aurora was published in the morning. The two principal journals for the Adams administration and Washington administration, or the Adams administration, were published in the afternoon, Porcupine's Gazette and the Gazette of the United States. And by allowing these newspapers to talk to themselves, what happens is a colloquy. And you can hear the publishers of these newspapers speaking to each other and addressing themselves as if in a conversation. And with those, I intersperse the letters of the most famous readers of the Aurora, including George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, James Monroe, and other important Americans who read the paper every day and would write to each other about what they read in the paper. The result of this, I think, is something which is not attainable in other books or found in other books, which is the ability to experience what it was like to be in Philadelphia in 1798, 99, 1800.
So you also tie the segments of the story together with kind of narrative by William Duane?
Yeah. Well, this is a very strange history, this book. It's not a history as most Americans have read a history. It's not from the point of view of the people who designed the Constitution and ran the government for the first 12 years, meaning from the point of view of the Federalists. This is, as I say, the point of view of a group of people who wanted the United States to be a pure democracy. So in order that the reader not be confused at any point, that there is a perspective in the telling of this history, I pose one of the editors to be as though he were telling the story. It's a fictional device, if you will, but it's a disregardable fictional device, which, as I identify in the author's preface, as well as in footnotes at the beginning of the book, so that one can read this as Duane telling the story, or if you choose not to, just as Rosenfeld telling the story in a more traditional historical way. But it is important for your viewers as well as the public to understand that the perspective being offered by this book is the history of the United States from the point of view of very virulent Democrats, people who really wanted to have a pure democracy. It is not the traditional objective historian's point of view. It's a voice from the past that was really regarded by Americans mostly as heretical and as mostly as radical. It would be my contention, and it's the book's contention, that in viewing these people that way, we are doing a great disservice to the telling of American history, because American history ought to be told from the point of view of those who care the most about democracy and civil liberties. That was not John Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. That was the voice of people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, who were the people, the founding fathers, who cared most about American democracy.
Can you set the stage a little bit for the start of this book? It was the end of the Washington administration. Can you go over who the political parties were? There was the Federalists and the Republicans. who was aligned with each one and what they believed in?
Yeah. Without giving a constitutional history, it's fair to say that the Federalists were the party of George Washington and John Adams. John Adams was, of course, George Washington's vice president who became president after 2 terms of George Washington's administration. These men were the Federalists in the sense that they wanted a strong federal government. They were Federalists in the sense that they had a deep respect for law, but a deep fear of the will of the majority to the extent that that was going to be expressed very democratically. They were, to the extent they favored representative government, it was representative by an elite who would speak for the majority. And it designed a constitution to achieve that kind of elite structure. You have to remember that when the Constitution was first developed, it was developed as a with a Senate that was not elected by the people, but by state legislatures. And in those state legislatures, there were senates where you had to have a substantial amount of property to be a state senator, and there were lots of, so that in effect you had a property veto on who would become U.S. senators. And there were a variety of other aspects of the design of the U.S. Constitution which were intended to put governance in the hands of those who tended to be most affluent and among the elite. That was that group. The opposition viewpoint, the Republican viewpoint,
and that is a different Republican Party than the present-day Republican Party.
Yes, this is the Republican Party of those we would probably call Democratic Republicans, because they call themselves Democratic Republicans in the late 1790s. People who wanted to have a republic of laws, what have you, but wanted it to be very democratic, wanted it to, for them the meaning of republic had changed somewhat. It meant something more akin to democracy as we would define democracy today, a representative government close to the people, or closer to the people. And these men were, so really what happened in the opening of this book in 1798 was that it was late in the stage of the French Revolution, and it was clear that the United States was in the process of choosing sides as to whether we were going to be on the side of France, which was now a democratic republic, or whether we were going to side with England, our former, the British monarch that we had fought our independence from. And that was a choice. For Democratic Republicans, there was no choice. They saw the French Revolution as something springing from the American Revolution, a revolution to overcome aristocracy and monarchy to give us a democracy. For the Federalists, who were not so passionate about democracy, the idea of democracy, they saw the French Revolution as representing the turbulence and violence of pure democracy, something they feared. And in the end, the Federalists made a choice to support, if you will, the British against the French. As this decision evolved, those on the Democratic side became more and more concerned. And where this book opens, it's at a time when the United States is preparing for war with France, and the Philadelphia Aurora, and the Democrats are outraged that it seems that that's the way things are happening, and the battle between Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, John Adams administration, is begun.
So Philadelphia was the capital city at the time, and we talked a little bit about the American Aurora, and on the other side of the aisle was the Gazette of the United States and Porcupine's Gazette.
Right.
Can you talk about each of those and who the lead characters were?
Well, as I've indicated, the Philadelphia Aurora, the Democratic Republican newspaper, leading Democratic Republican newspaper, was published by Benjamin Franklin's grandson and by his successor, William Duane. The two other newspapers that I focus on in the book, the Gazette of the United States. Gazette of the United States was being published with the support of John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, financial support by a man by the name of John Fenno, who had who was an unsuccessful Boston businessman who had come to New York to start a newspaper at the urging of Adams and Hamilton, in effect to support the Federalist administration of Washington when the government was first beginning. And during the 1790s, the Gazette of the United States under John Fenno was the leading newspaper in the United States for the administrations of Washington and Adams. Its offices were on Chestnut Street, really a block away from the Aurora on the opposite side from Market. And John Fenner was the printer to the United States Senate. He got most of the government printing. When he had problems, he could go to Washington, Adams, whoever, and get financing from one of the principal Federalists. The other newspaper was being published by a British subject, William Cobbett, at that time someone who had served in the British Army in Canada and who came to the United States also in the mid-1790s, and he started his newspaper called Porcupine's Gazette. William Cobbett, his pen name would be Peter Porcupine, and he would sign most of his editorials Peter Porcupine because his quill was so sharp, of course. And he was a British subject, and over across from Christ Church here in Philadelphia, he opened a shop and he put pictures of royalty in the windows, painted the building blue. It no longer exists, and he wrote from a royalist, federalist point of view, a very, very radically conservative point of view. And he was, in fact, he started his newspaper on the day John Adams became president, and he was the favorite, John Adams' favorite newspaper. He represented the very British point of view. And I might say that as soon as it was clear John Adams was no longer going to be president, Porcupine left Philadelphia. And it was always suspected that Porcupine really was an emissary from the British government to try to push things in a British direction during the Adams administration.
How widely read were newspapers at the time?
Well, I think you have to speak of different newspapers. At that time, it was customary for newspapers without attribution to be copied by other newspapers, and there was a franking privilege of newspapers to send their newspapers cost-free to other newspapers throughout the country. So while the circulation of the Gazette of the United States or the Philadelphia Aurora or Porcupine's Gazette might be around 2,000, nevertheless, what it wrote, since it was in Philadelphia, the capital of the country, and it had access to international news and national news the most closely, it was copied. It was sent free throughout the nation, and it was copied by Federalist papers or Democratic Republicans newspapers throughout the country. And so its influence was far beyond its subscriber base. And in the case of the Aurora, which was read by the poorer people, the lower-born people in the country, those people tended to pass the newspaper from hand to hand, or leave it in taverns, which serve sort of as libraries of the poor. And so the multiplier, the readership factor, as opposed to the circulation or print factor, was very great for the Democratic Republican newspapers. So they were widely read, and some newspapers would copy the Aurora day by day. It was actually so ridiculous, all the copying, that sometimes the Aurora itself would copy something that it had originally published from another newspaper, having forgotten that it originally published it. So there was copyright wasn't a major factor in this.
Can you compare a newspaper of the 1790s, 1800 to newspapers today? I mean, how much comment do you get compared to what we would call today news?
I think that there was no strong distinction in the minds of publishers between editorial and news. There were columns in the newspaper that were clearly editorial, where the items chosen would clearly favor the newspaper's point of view, and where the publisher himself would make some observations, usually unsigned. But in fact, generally, the entire newspaper represented the point of view, unless they were perhaps reporting Congress, a transcript of what was happening in Congress or something of this sort. So I would say there wasn't the clear differentiation we would have today between the editorial pages and the news pages. But everyone understood that. Everyone knew what the point of view of the newspaper they were subscribing to. It was his or her point of view, and so there was no question about that.
Where did you find all these newspapers in your research?
Well, a lot of these newspapers are, the Aurora, for example, is kept at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, outside of Boston, which is the largest repository for early American documents in the world.
Are they copied, or do you get the original?
Well, you can get the originals there. A historian doing research who wants to see the originals can find them there. but they're also in microfilm, so that most university libraries, large university libraries, would have microfilm of the Aurora and Gazette of the United States and Porcupine Gazette, university microfilms of Michigan, as well as Redex microfilms of, I believe it's Rhode Island, Connecticut, has done a tremendous job of reproducing all this on microfilm, and so it is available to scholars on microfilm. That's the way I basically used it on microfilm.
And you said this was your first book?
This is my first book, yeah.
What was it like to go reading through all those newspapers? Was it painstaking or was it kind of fun?
It was a tremendous amount of fun. There's a great secret, I think, that the public doesn't know, and that secret is that the historians do not live in the world of the dead and the past. Historians live in the world of the living, because when you read original documents, you read letters written by people back and forth to each other at a given moment in time, or read newspapers talking to each other on a given day. Those people are no longer dead. They're alive and talking to each other, and you experience them just as you would reading a letter from a friend today. So that's one of the purposes of this book, I hope, is to allow readers the excitement of reading early original documents, not having it filtered through a historian's voice, but giving them as much as possible the original documents. And those who read the book generally agree that those original documents make the book lively in a way an ordinary history can never be lively.
Was it hard to find a publisher for a book like this? I mean, it's over 1,000 pages.
1,000 pages of 18th century text, $40. It was difficult to find a publisher. It was, I thought it was courageous of St. Martin's to do it. The book has been selling very well. It was nominated for Pulitzer. It was chosen by the Los Angeles Times as the best history book of 1997. It was a finalist in the Robert Kennedy Awards, one of 5 finalists. So the book has received a lot of recognition around the country, and in fact is the subject. An entire course is being taught around the book at the University of Alabama right now, this semester. And so I think that its new vision of American history, telling it from this democratic point of view, is finding a following, and I certainly hope that continues.
How long did it take you to write?
About 4 years.
And also on the back, there's praise for American Aurora, and Doris Kearns Goodwin, Pulitzer Prize winner, is quoted. Benno Schmidt, former president of Yale University. Ira Glasser, executive director of American Civil Liberties Union. How do you get these people to endorse your book?
Send them a manuscript and say, won't you take a look?
Do they do that for free?
Yeah, absolutely. I was the keynote speaker at the American Civil Liberties Union National Dinner in Washington at the National Archives, where the Bill of Rights documents are kept this year. The American Civil Liberties Union sees this book as a very important description of a time when there was no federal court system to enforce the Bill of Rights, where remember that Marbury versus Madison wasn't decided till 1803 or 4. That the federal courts couldn't toss out the Alien and Sedition Acts. They couldn't strike down the acts of the Adams administration in trying to silence these newspaper editors, and that the only court of appeal was the court of public opinion. So here you have a defense of the First Amendment by these editors and by Democratic Republican supporters at a time when they're going out into the streets, they're publishing in the face of really unconstitutional acts by the Adams administration, was the first test of the First Amendment, and it couldn't be a court test. So it's a very important civil libertarian, it's a time from a civil libertarian point of view, and it's a time, and really this book is long overdue in terms of telling this time in a very detailed way.
I'd like to go over briefly about some of the main characters in politics at the time: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and start off with some of the relationships and what they thought of each other. You quote John Adams here, talking about George Washington, as saying that Washington was not a scholar is certain, that he was too illiterate, unlearned, unread for his station, and reputation is equally beyond dispute. He had derived little knowledge from reading, none from travel.
Well, of course, this book is reinforcing a viewpoint that was not, let's see if I can express it a slightly different way. The mythology of Washington as the father of this country is a Federalist mythology. Washington was, in fact, the figurehead for the Federalist Party, Hamilton, Adams, all of these people had Washington as the first president because he was clearly a perfect person to represent them in the government. In a way, he acted somewhat as a king. Really, Hamilton ran the cabinet without comparing exactly with the British system. It was Hamilton, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, head of the party, running the cabinet, and Washington sitting up as a bit of a symbol. And the Democratic-Republican point of view about Washington was that this mythology was dangerous to the country, that it, among other things, denied Democrats like Benjamin Franklin his fair due, and in fact that the Federalists, Washington, Adams, and others had discredited Benjamin Franklin because they feared him as a Democrat. You remember when Franklin died, though Philadelphia had the largest funeral the country had ever seen to that point, it was only the House of Representatives that agreed to mourn Franklin's death. Washington refused to have the executive branch mourn Franklin's death, and the United States Senate, under John Adams as president of the Senate, refused to have the Senate mourn Franklin's death. So it was only the people and the People's House, the House of Representatives, that mourned Franklin's death. Well, Democratic Republicans saw the discrediting of Franklin, the belittling of Franklin by the Federalists during the 1790s, and the mythologizing of Washington's role as dangerous. And therefore, they began to retell the tale of the Revolution to show that Washington really hadn't won the Revolution France had, that Washington had been an incompetent general, and that his reputation was myth. And this book though Bache died before his sedition trial, this book attempts to give Bache the sedition trial he never had, to test these claims, to see what support there is in history for the vision of America's beginnings that these editors put forth. And of course, that's why I don't call the book The Philadelphia Aurora, but American Aurora, since it's about really the whole beginning of the country and how to look at it.
How did Thomas Jefferson fit in? How did he relate to Adams and Washington?
Well, Jefferson was the leader, I'd say a symbolic leader, if you will, of the Democratic Republicans. He was vice president at the time. This was before the president and the vice president had to be of the same party. So you had John Adams as president, and you had Jefferson as vice president. Interestingly, the Sedition Act that John Adams' party passed and he signed prohibited criticism of government officials except vice presidents, so that Federalists were left free to criticize Jefferson. One more bit of evidence that this was a party act and not an act having to do with the defense of the nation. But Jefferson was the symbol then, as he is today, of democratic values. And though there have been books written to show that Jefferson was not completely the author of the Declaration of Independence, nevertheless, even at this time when he was about to be elected president, the Democratic Republicans cited him as the author of the Declaration of Independence. Though he may have not throughout his whole life been tolerant about slaves or intolerant of slavery, nevertheless, he was the symbol of the anti-slavery movement of the Democratic Republicans in the 1790s. And though he may have, during his presidency, have been in various ways unfriendly to the press, nevertheless, he was also seen as the leading opponent of chains on the press, as the leading proponent of a free press in the 1790s. So he was an icon in the 1790s as he is today. That's not an iconology that's happened later. And so therefore I have a bit of trouble with historians who bring in a lot of facts that no one during Jefferson's time knew or did not influence the public perception of him. The public perception of Jefferson that elected him president was the perception of him as a Democrat, the way he has been revered over time ever since his life.
Well, has he been mythologized as much as Washington was?
I think to some extent he has been, although of course it's mythologizing Jefferson is using an icon that did in fact represent democracy in the nation. Mythologizing Washington and Adams are mythologizing people who fear democracy, and there's a qualitative difference, in my view at least.
I want to talk about the Sedition Act, which you mentioned, and the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were different laws. You do quote Jefferson in here as saying the Alien and Sedition Acts are merely an experiment on the American mind to see how far it will bear an avowed violation of the Constitution. If this goes down, we shall immediately see an attempt attempted another act of Congress declaring that the president shall continue in office during life, reserving to another occasion the transfer of the succession to his heirs and the establishment of the Senate for life. Was that a real possibility?
Well, that's a matter, if you accept that as a real possibility, then, as this book argues, you have to tell American history completely differently. Because Jefferson's view, and the view of these editors and people who were close to these editors, was that in fact George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton would have been perfectly happy to have the British Constitution in the United States with a hereditary king, with a landed aristocracy and an upper house of the legislature, and that in fact creating the form of the British Constitution in the American Constitution was only a step in their mind toward bringing monarchy to the United States, bringing these feared institutions back again. So there's been great debate among historians as to whether John Adams was in fact a monarchist, as this newspaper, the Philadelphia Aurora, alleged, as Jefferson believed, and as many Americans believe, which is in fact why John Adams was not elected president re-elected president in 1800, and Jefferson was. But that decision is a critical decision for Americans in deciding how American history should be told. Because if you see Adams and the Federalists as really opponents of democracy, as really people who would have been happy with the British Constitution here, then you would tell the story of the 1790s and the beginning of this country quite differently, not as we've traditionally told it. So when you ask me whether Jefferson was right, that what was happening in Philadelphia in the late 1790s with the Alien Sedition Acts was one step toward monarchy in this country, the next step being that we'd have senators for life, and then the hereditary principle would come back, which is what Jefferson feared was the movement of Adams and Hamilton and the Federalists at this time. Then if you accept Jefferson's point of view, we should tell American history very differently than we do.
What specifically did the Sedition Acts prohibit or require, and what effect did they have?
Well, the Alien Sedition Acts, and I'm going to include both because I think it's important to understand that if it's true today, it's even more true then that the United States is a nation of immigrants. There were no U.S. citizens, if you will, until, from a British point of view at least, until you had 1783 when they recognized the United States. So that we're only talking 15 years later, and there are still lots of people arriving in the United States from Europe to become citizen. So in passing acts against aliens, so-called, against would-be citizens, you were dealing with a large population in the country, and if you could frighten them into silence by saying, as the Alien Acts did, that the president can exile anybody who he suspected of disloyalty without a trial and without a hearing, you can achieve the same silence that you can through a Sedition Act. Now, the Sedition Act was aimed at citizens. It said, although it could include aliens as well, it said that anyone who criticized the federal government or the president or cast aspersions or said things that would be unkind to his reputation could be jailed. And people were jailed for saying that John Adams was boastful or proud or what have you. And so and one man was fined for laughingly suggesting that he didn't care if someone shot a cannonball through Adams' backside. So the net effect of it was that a lot of newspaper editors were jailed. A lot of newspapers closed, opposition newspapers, Democratic Republican newspapers. In fact, all of the major newspapers, Democratic Republican newspapers north of Virginia, except the Aurora, the major ones were closed. And so it was a pretty horrific period.
They were closed by arresting the publisher?
Arresting the publisher.
Why did the Aurora get spared?
It's a good question. I think they did try every possible. As I said, they indicted Bache for sedition, but Bache died before the sedition trial. Had he not gone to jail, what would have happened with the Aurora is subject to speculation. They certainly tried to indict his successor and jail him. In the end, his successor, William Duane, had to go into hiding as a result of Federalist actions. and edited the newspaper from hiding at the end of the 18th century. So a lot was done. In fact, the crowds of Federalists attacked the Aurora's offices when Bache was publisher, as well as when Duane was publisher. And the Federal Army officers in 1799 attacked the Aurora, took Duane out into the public marketplace on Market Street amid the shambles there, and beat him and beat his son.
This was federal troops?
Federal troops. And so a lot was done to silence the Aurora. To some extent, I think probably the Aurora is protected by Franklin's reputation. After all, it was being published in a print shop that was built by Benjamin Franklin using Benjamin Franklin's press. A lot of institutions in Philadelphia, of course, were Franklin in their origins, and so I think that there was some restraint for a certain period of time until we got well into 1798 that spared the Aurora kind of great violent action. But that came to an end, certainly, especially when Duane took over. A lot was done to close it.
You also mentioned that the editor of or the publisher of the Reading Eagle was also beaten by federal troops.
Yeah, Jacob Schneiderman, I think, Schneider was his name. Yeah, that was also during the so-called Freeze Rebellion. This has, how you talk about American history, again, depends on how you've learned it. If you've learned it from what I would describe as a Federalist point of view, you might call it the Freeze Rebellion, meaning that these rebellious Germans were had to be suppressed by the federal government because they were a threat to the government, and they were opposing John Adams' taxes. If you're a Democratic Republican telling the story, you would see these people, the countryside, as not rising up, but expressing their opposition to Adams, to unconstitutional acts, the Sedition Acts, the Sedition Act and the Alien Acts, as well as the war taxes that Adams had imposed in order to fight the proposed war with France, in effect. And the federal troops went into the countryside and suppressed that opposition by entering people's homes, tearing down liberty poles, beating, as you say, newspaper editors that reported army abuses, and otherwise infringing on the rights of Americans. And you really call it federal army abuses rather than a Freeze Rebellion. And when those federal troops returned to Philadelphia, 30 Army officers attacked the Philadelphia Aurora for their reporting of army abuses, and they, as I say, they beat Duane and they beat his son.
What is a liberty pole?
A liberty pole is something that was erected during the American Revolution to start with. It's a symbol of opposition to the British, a symbol of opposition to Toryism, to what have you, and just a symbol of political opposition, freedom.
I want to read something. You mentioned that Benjamin Beach died in the yellow fever epidemic, 1798. And John Adams, after Beach died, says here, Benjamin Beach in his Aurora became, of course, one of the most malicious libelers of me, but the yellow fever arrested him in his detestable career and sent him to his grandfather, Benjamin Franklin, from whom he inherited a dirty, envious, jealous, and revengeful spite against me for no other cause under heaven than because I was too honest a man to favor or connive at his selfish schemes of ambition and avarice. It's pretty strong words. Adams and Franklin did not get along?
Adams hated Franklin from his time in France. I would say the resentments were even evident before Adams got to France. It was a combination of jealousy, of political opposition, because Franklin was a great Democrat and Adams wasn't, and a sense of the fact that Adams wanted to be seen as a great and powerful founding father. It was clear to him that he would become not to be seen that way, and that Franklin was going to be seen throughout the world as an important figure.
I want to backtrack a little bit to the Washington administration, because I wanted to read this about the Aurora writing about George Washington. And this is your wording here. Not content merely to criticize Washington's presidency, the Aurora attacked his leadership during the American Revolution, describing his mental faculties as unadorned by extraordinary features or uncommon capacity, his politics as inoffensive neutrality. It portrayed Washington as lukewarm toward independence, incompetent as a military leader, and deserving little credit for the final outcome of the war. How accurate is that?
Well, this book provides the evidence that what the Aurora said is true. I can make my own judgment about that evidence. I think there is substantial evidence to suggest that George Washington was not a very great military leader. I think there's substantial evidence to suggest that it was France and Franklin who saved the revolution for Washington. And this book provides that evidence. And you have to remember in the final battle of Yorktown, for example, Washington brought 2,000 troops from New York to Yorktown. The French brought 32,000 military to Yorktown. Washington troops would not go to Yorktown without a bribe. They didn't want to fight in the South. France provided them money to bribe Washington's troops to fight. The France had twice as many wounded at Yorktown as Americans. They had twice as many killed at Yorktown as Americans. When Yorktown was a siege, Washington had no siege experience. Rochambeau and the French had invented the art of siege warfare. They were very experienced. Rochambeau had participated in 14 sieges. They conducted Yorktown. When it was time for Cornwallis to surrender at Yorktown, he tried to surrender to Rochambeau, to the French, but the French directed him, compelled him, in effect, to surrender to Washington. The British regarded it as really a French event, not an American event, what happened at Yorktown. And yet, when the story was told about Yorktown, American historians make Washington the hero. Many of Washington's slaves fought him at Yorktown, joined the British to fight him. We don't tell history from that point of view. The Aurora did. And of course, the reason this book has become so controversial is that it's really, I think, the first time someone has tried to take what the Aurora and other radical Democratic Republicans have said in the late 1790 and ask the question, is it possible that it's true? And that's really what the premise of the book is.
Of the two parties at the time, the Federalists and the Republicans, who won? If they came back, if Adams and Jefferson came back and looked at the United States now, which one would think, I won?
Well, that's a very, very complicated subject. Very, very complicated subject. Because it's clear today that we've changed the words a bit. When we talk about the imperial presidency today, we don't speak of it as a monarchical presidency. I suspect that the Democratic Republicans would. They feared, the Democratic Republicans who published the Aurora did not want to have an independent executive branch, an independent president. They wanted to have simply a legislative branch, House of Representatives, House of Commons, that would choose its president, and the president would be served, in effect, at the pleasure of the House of Representatives. This idea of an independent executive president who can decide to commit troops and things of that sort without the approval of Congress, essentially, that imperial presidency, they would say, is monarchical. Likewise, when we hear about PAC committees and people sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom today, Democratic Republicans would say that's the ultimate aristocracy, that we had fought a revolution to prevent people of property and wealth from running the government, from having a disproportionate say in our democracy, and that when it's clear that you can only be elected to the Senate or even the House if you have a lot of money, and that if you tend to get millionaires, affluent people in office in the Senate, when it takes tremendous amounts of money to run for office, and when wealthy groups, lobbyists and others, are able to insinuate themselves in the process of making legislation in a way where you cannot predict the outcome of legislation based on what the popular will is. You have to predict the outcome of legislation based on the power of certain lobby groups, the power of certain kinds of machinations you don't fully understand. Then you're no longer, then you're more in the kind of government that John Adams wanted, a government run by not the majority of the ordinary people, but in fact by a government balanced, where those ordinary people are balanced by people of wealth and special qualification.
Well, like you say in your conclusions in the book here, among your conclusions, you say that it is not by chance that American presidents and senators are on average wealthier than members of the House of Representatives. It is by design.
Well, of course, that was the whole issue of how we designed the United States government. The United States Senate and the presidency were purposely created not to be institutions based on small congressional districts where ordinary people could choose and know their representatives, as the House of Representatives would have been had it been exactly as Benjamin Franklin had wanted it, not as it ultimately ended up being. And that, in fact, if you look at the kind of money it takes to run statewide for us to be a Senate, even in 1913, the system was changed where no longer state legislatures elected senators, chose senators, the people themselves directly did. That was thought at the time, I think, to be more democratic, but in fact it wasn't. If you look at the Federalist concept of aristocracy, if you will, the larger the voting district, the more likely it was that somebody of wealth and property would become the representatives, because it required reputation, more wealth to span the distances involved in a large voting district, like a state. So so to run for the United States Senate, you have to have a lot more money and a lot more money behind you than you do, for example, to run for Congress. And I think if you look historically at the average wealth of a United States senator compared with that of the average wealth of a U.S. congressman, you'd find that senators are wealthier. That's the result of larger and larger voting districts. And of course, presidents are even more so. Even if the president himself is not wealthy, the kind of wealth required to make someone president means that a lot of very wealthy people are going to have a disproportionate say as to how the presidency operates.
Can I ask you briefly about yourself? Where are you from originally?
Boston. Boston, attended Yale, law school at Columbia, master's in law at Boston University. I was in business for many years. I sold my business in 1986 to pursue philanthropic and other pursuits, family pursuits, and this is my first return to the world of scholarship, and it's been a wonderful experience. What did you study in college? I created my own major in college, which was called the Philosophical Foundations for Modern Political Ideology. It was a divisional major which allowed me to take political philosophy and as well as political theory, political philosophy from the philosophy side of things and political theory from the political science side of things. You say in the last page of the book, your credits, my interest in America's political history was first excited by an extraordinary high school history teacher, the late Richard Wickenden at Tabor Academy. What does it take to make a good history teacher? Well, this book makes an argument that history, the passions belong in history. It's not something you take out of history. That this book tries to get the reader to feel the passions of Democratic Republicans, to, if you will, take their side. In experiencing those feelings, those Democratic Republican feelings, you are getting very close to the authentic historical experience. I would say Richard Wickenden was great because he got his students involved in a passionate way in the materials he presented. In fact, when he spoke with a certain amount of spray from his mouth, and if you sat in the first rows of the classroom, you were likely to be drenched by the end of the performance. But he would lean forward with a big fist. He was a bear of a man, and he would speak with passion. And I took the shower. I went right up there. I got caught in his passion, whether he discussed communism or the Bill of Rights or the whatever aspect of American history he talked. I found myself right with him, and it remains to this day. You know, I like to think that he'd be proud of his high school student doing this. Have you ever taught? No, although I had experience. I was invited by a school, the Altamont School down in Alabama, to teach some history classes there for a day, and it was a wonderful experience. It was thrilling. So I think that, and of course I've been lecturing about the book. I talked to the Friends of the Franklin Papers at Yale and other groups. I taught for a day at the Fletcher School at Tufts. I taught for a day at the Shorenstein Center of the Press at Harvard. So at Kennedy School at Harvard. So I've had some lecturing experiences, which have been my first, of course, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly. And you're married? Married. My wife Ann, who's here with me in Philadelphia. We have 2 children. One's a newspaper writer in Los Angeles. Another is working as a financial analyst in New York. Neither are history buffs, but wonderful kids. How did you find out about the Philadelphia Aurora in the first place? Well, you know, I'm not a historian by trade. I'm a civil libertarian. What I do care about, I've always served on boards of the American Civil Liberties Union and what have you, and I was involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s. I talked about William Sloane Coffin Jr. And the inspiration he was to me in this book. I want to write a book about civil liberties, and the first part of the book was about the First Amendment and the Sedition Act, because I thought it was very funny that 7 years after the Bill of Rights had been ratified, George Washington and John Adams should be instituting a law that made it imprisonable to criticize the president. That was only 7 years after the Bill of Rights. And when I got there to look at that period, at first I thought I had no story to write at all, because I thought the United States was preparing for war with France. And after all, curtailment of the press during wartime is acceptable even under our present constitutional regime. I thought there was nothing to talk about. But when I saw that the Washington and Adams were trying to quiet the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, that they were trying to imprison the grandson of Franklin, and I found some literature from Adams saying that he saw this grandson as carrying on against him the same campaign that Franklin was carrying on, then I began to wonder whether Washington and Adams were trying to suppress the ghost of Benjamin Franklin. And the moment I saw the Philadelphia Aurora as the ghost of Benjamin Franklin, then I began to ask the question, well, what possibly could have been the relationship between Franklin and Adams and Washington, which would want Franklin, make Adams and Washington want to jail Franklin's ghost? So that suddenly the civil libertarian got excited by a story which suggested to me that national security was not the reason for the Sedition Act and the Alien Act, but really there was something else going on here, and something that Franklin wouldn't have liked. So that's when I began to look into the relationship between Franklin and Adams and Washington, and discovered this bifurcation of U.S. Ideology between people like Franklin and Paine, who had wanted the United States to be a democracy, and people like Washington and Adams and Hamilton, who had succeeded in preventing the United States from being a democracy. At that point, the battle between the Aurora and the Federalists, Adams and Washington, in the late 1790s, took on heroic proportions. It was the David against the Goliath. This young man, who after all, when he died, was only 29, this young man taking on the Founding Fathers, who were 2 generations ahead of him, and bringing them down. Washington refused to run for a 3rd term because of the Aurora. Everyone attributed the Aurora's criticism of Washington as to why he left office. And there's no question, as Thomas Jefferson said, that the Aurora was what put Jefferson in the White House and got rid of John Adams. So these young men took on a different generation in the name of democracy, and effectively destroyed forever the political party of Washington and Adams and Hamilton.
Now, one of the things I learned from your book is George Washington was much more involved in politics than is generally thought after he retired. You have him writing a lot of letters.
He does write a lot of letters. Of course, you know, as John Adams prepared for war with France, he brought back Washington to be head of the army. And Washington agreed to be head of the army and got involved in army planning for a potential invasion, although he would only actively serve, he said, when the French, in fact, did invade, which they never did. But he still presided over the army, and Alexander Hamilton was the second in command. So he really retired, but he was brought back during this period to be involved in defense preparations.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to go briefly, if you could run down, I want to give you a couple of names and have you give me a couple of sentences about what you personally think about each of them. Thomas Paine.
A great Democrat, one of the founding fathers. When Paine came forward with common sense, though it's not popularly understood, this was the first time that anyone said that the United States should be a democracy, a pure democracy, the Franklinian type of democracy. And when he came out with that message, suddenly the whole country swung toward revolution, and which raises the question, at least in my mind, whether in fact there weren't a lot of Democrats in 1776, something that historians generally have not acknowledged.
John Adams.
John Adams was a man who was somewhat emotionally unbalanced, who saw himself as, throughout his life, as a life that was to be heroic, to be important, always felt that he was not recognized as such, even when he was president, went to his death believing that he would be vilified as he was in the 1790s. He is not as great a founding father as popularly perceived, argued, and most of the people who think highly of John Adams base it on correspondence of him at the end of his life when he softened, changed from the villain he appears in this book and the way he conducted his politics in France and in the United States in the 1780s and 90s.
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson was a private person who really wasn't cut out for politics, but was a philosopher who kept getting dragged into it. He was not a fighter. He was not going to stand up for the principles that he talked about. He would often urge other people to write for newspapers and confront the Federalists, but he himself would boast that he had never written for a newspaper. He may have authored the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, but he never publicly came forward with them. It was up to the editors of this newspaper and other Democratic Republican newspapers to fight the fight for democracy against the Federalists. When the day that Bache was arrested and the Federalists came to the Aurora's office, that was the day that Jefferson went back to Virginia from Philadelphia. And the Federalist papers made a note of the fact that this was Jefferson leaving once again in the face of opposition.
Abigail Adams.
Someone intensely loyal to John Adams, someone who I think was the mirror image of his political beliefs, the best of all possible wives, and from whose vitriol one can conclude a lot about John Adams and how he saw. John Adams did not do too much writing, letter writing or others, during his presidency, letter writing or otherwise. When one reads the letters of Abigail Adams during his presidency, however, one gets the flavor for what was going on in his mind and in his house.
George Washington.
George Washington was an American icon. He persevered in the American Revolution, and some say that he earns his credit by having stuck with it. Others would say, as the Democratic Republicans would say, that, well, who didn't stick with it other than Benedict Arnold? So that distinguishing him on that basis is difficult. He was the logical choice for president. After all, we had no government other than the Continental government, that was the Continental Congress and the Army. The Army was the great American institution, and he was the head of it, and they had won no great battles. There were no other generals made great by the war. The war was basically a war of retreat and defeat. So Washington was simply there. He was a wealthy man who rarely spoke on politics at all. If you asked the average American, what did George Washington think about democracy or anything else, the average American would say, I don't have a clue. So we have a founding father without a political belief. So, but he was a good icon. He served the Federalists well in that capacity. I would not give him high marks either as a general or not so much as a president either, really.
You have here, when George Washington dies, you say, George Washington's wife, Martha, immediately burns certain of his papers, and his nephew, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Bushrod Washington, will discard some, remove signatures from others, and license their publication to Jared Sparks, a Harvard historian and future Harvard president, who will control, withhold, and even reword them for the sake of Washington's reputation, and will be their only publisher for the next 100 years. What was your source of that?
Well, I think I footnote some of it, endnote some of it. I don't recall. I think that's generally well known that Jared Sparks altered documents and that.
What were they burning to
we don't know. We don't know what Martha Washington was burning when that was something I believe that was noted in the first volume of Jared Sparks's publication of the documents of Washington, but in any event, it's endnoted. But I think that's generally noted. We don't know why or what was burned precisely. It is interesting to note, though, that within 2 months before he died, he was fearful that he was going to be subpoenaed to testify or to provide evidence at Duane's trial the publisher of the Aurora's trial, or at Duane's trial, because Duane had published that there had been British influence in the Washington administration, and that the British were exercising authority over Washington. And they produced, Duane had produced at that trial a letter from John Adams saying that he saw British influence in the Washington administration, and Washington wrote some correspondence suggesting that he was concerned about being asked about that episode in his administration. So I don't know whether this related to that. It came shortly after. I really don't know.
How has your opinion of these people changed as a result of you writing this book?
Well, what this book makes clear, I think, is that Benjamin Franklin was a much different figure than we think of him as. We think of Benjamin Franklin very often as an avuncular humorist, an inventor, perhaps a womanizer in France, a smooth diplomat, a lot of things like this. And these were images created by his enemies, the Federalists, John Adams and others, after the war, when they were trying to discredit Franklin during the 1790s. Those who knew Adams, knew Franklin well, his friends, would not describe him that way. They would describe him as a great American, one of the most important Americans, probably the most important. If you asked Thomas Jefferson who the father of the country was, he would not say George Washington, he'd say Benjamin Franklin. And this book makes clear that what Franklin's role in the Revolution was in getting France in and saving Washington, and in providing an image of the democracy that would endure. The people who elected Thomas Jefferson president, these editors and who led the country to elect him president, were not essentially Jeffersonians. They were Franklinites. They were followers of Benjamin Franklin. They were followers of his vision of democracy. Really, democracy in America starts with Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, not with Thomas Jefferson. And these editors were followers of Franklin.
This is the cover of the book, 1,000 pages, 2,000 footnotes, American Aurora. Richard Rosenfeld, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.